and welcome to Darshan America. Ramesh is off this week. I'm Shilpa Alimchandani.
And I'm Asta Verma. And for those of you that are our loyal viewers, this is a bit of an interesting show because we've never co-hosted together.
That's true. All these years on Darshan, and the first time we're paired up. So it's kind of fun to be here with you, Asta.
I think so. And I know we've got a ton of stories to get started on, starting with the most important story of the week, which is President Obama's trip to India. Of course, it's more than just a trip to India. He's actually visiting Indonesia, and then eventually he'll be going to the G20 summit in South Korea. But India took center stage for the first 3 days of his trip, and it was quite substantial what he said, and also meeting the people and the questions that he faced. It was all quite substantial.
Of course, the timing for Obama was a bit difficult coming off of the midterm elections, but he was greeted very warmly in India, and it was nice to see that chemistry between Prime Minister Singh and President Obama. They clearly seem to have some similarities and really like and respect one another quite a bit. And it was also good to see that this trip was about getting to know the people. He celebrated Diwali in India and had a nice time. We all saw the video of Michelle Obama, of course, dancing with the children.
I think that was important.
Yeah.
It was important for her to connect with the people because I think President Obama is having a hard time with that. And the fact that she mingled so freely with everyone, and she's a very down-to-earth person to begin with. We know that here from just her interaction in the U.S., but overseas, you know, people see things differently. And his visit was anticipated. And for those of you that saw parts of his news conference that he held at St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, you saw that he really faced some tough questions. The thing that surprised me was, one, they asked him about the midterm elections, which meant that the people overseas in India are paying attention to what's happening on the national front here, the election process here. And second, that he was asked such sharp questions about Pakistan, which surprised me. You know, I know that, of course, India is interested in this line of discussion with President Obama, but the fact that they asked him point blank, I thought it was pretty gutsy of us to ask and gutsy of him to answer.
Right. I mean, a young female student said, "Why aren't you calling Pakistan a terrorist state?" And I think there are very wide, varying opinions on that. What was fascinating then was soon thereafter when he was speaking in Delhi at Parliament, he addressed this issue much more directly than he did at the college, in which he was being very cautious in his choice of words. To Parliament, he did speak out more forcefully, saying that Pakistan really should not be acceptable, the amount of support for terrorism. And I think that was something that Indians were waiting to hear. Clearly, he is right to say that Pakistan's stability is good for India.
That's the key point. That's the key point. I think, you know, as much as his answer might not have satisfied the Indian audience he was with, it may not have even satisfied those Indians living here in the U.S., but I think his answer had to be the only answer he could give. I mean, a stable Pakistan would be good for India because it means less attention paid to those border skirmishes. And at the end of the day, India is still reeling off of a terrorist attack that took place not that long ago. I thought it was very symbolic of President Obama to stay at the very hotel that was the center point of this terrorist activity. So in his own way, I think he was demonstrating that show of support, even if he wasn't vocalizing it quite to the extent that the people were hoping.
And he did, thankfully, openly say that India should have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So that was definitely a big plus. We were waiting to hear that from him. The other thing that I read as somewhat of a criticism, you could say, of India, but perhaps a warranted one, was getting involved in international affairs in a more direct way, especially when it comes to humanitarian concerns. Just next door in Myanmar, in Burma, there has been so much repression for years. And now we've had this kind of fake election in Burma, which everybody knows wasn't real to begin with, and the people continue to suffer. India remains pretty silent on the issue, and Obama quite openly said, you know what, it's a time for democracies like ours to say something, that we have a responsibility on the global stage, even though this is, you could say, a matter in another country, but as democratic nations, given our values and what we believe in human rights, we should say something.
It's a fair criticism. I think it's fair. For decades, India has had the luxury to just focus inwardly on itself and not really worry about what's happening outside of its borders, except for, of course, what happens in the northern border regions with Pakistan or China. But I think it's a very fair thing to say. If India wants to participate on the global stage, if it wants to be a part of the G20, the G8, and then now the UN Security Council, it needs to demonstrate that it is willing to get into these global type issues that matter to the rest of the world. It can't just be about trade. It can't just be about the economy. It has to be about stability in the region. To add to your point, I think President Obama's visit to India was also strategic for this region. I think the reason for that is because you have China, which is becoming an emergent, dominant player in the region, and you have a politically unstable Pakistan. Then you have India, which is sitting squarely in the middle of both of these nations. It makes sense for him to reach out to India to foster the relations there, because India will serve in the long term as a stabilizing force between both of those nations.
But I think in terms of Americans and how they're viewing this trip, it has less to do with regional stability than it has to do with economics, right? Yeah. Because Obama has, in the White House, has been very forceful in saying this is about jobs for Americans. Let's not just focus on outsourcing. The relationship with India is much more complex than that. And working with this major economic power means that it could create more jobs for us here at home. You know, there's been so much buzz about the number of business people who traveled with Obama to India and the number of deals that got closed, the number of money that was supposed to be coming back. So I think that's been the sell. Not so much of the regional stability, but money, economy, jobs. That's what Americans are interested in hearing. Let's see if they buy it.
I hope they do. I think it's a bit of a stretch argument to make, to say that shortly after the economy becomes the center point of this midterm election, that he would go overseas to India to try to foster economic relations there. But I think there is some truth to that. I think the balance, the trade imbalance, has forever favored India. It has not favored the U.S. And for him to make that point now, when outsourcing is a bone of contention here, in fact, for the first time, you have the Democrats sort of squarely aligned on one side of that, saying, no, we don't want our jobs to go overseas. For him to go there and make a plea for exactly that, to say, no, we need more of the trade to function for us, to benefit back to the U.S. in terms of jobs. I think it's a very interesting message to send to India. It's certainly going to demonstrate to the people at home that he's concerned about this. Whether or not it pans out into something tangible, that's the question I have.
So there's one quote I want to share with you directly from President Obama's speech to the Indian Parliament. He said, "India is not simply emerging. India has already emerged." I think that's a very powerful message.
Well, on the subject of outsourcing, I read a story in the Post that might have caught your eye, it caught mine, about how outsourcing has just literally changed in the last decade. You know, we've always thought traditionally about outsourcing jobs here to India. Well, now, jobs in India are being outsourced to other nations.